If you're an investor who's working with a portfolio manager or a financial advisor at a nationally regulated firm, do you ever think about how he or she is helping you make better wealth decisions while concurrently complying with all the rules and obligations that are part of the industry? We'll talk about that this week. This is Make Better Wealth Decisions, a podcast about financial blind spots, decision-making, and how the reality of higher rates, global tensions, and tariff instability impact your investments. I'm your host, John DeGuy, a portfolio manager with Design Securities in Toronto. Our guest this week is Fardan Ali. Fardan is a compliance manager at Design Securities and has worked with hundreds of advisors through branch audits and core supervision. He brings a unique perspective in compliance, focusing on following the rules, but he's also wary of industry best practices. Fardan, how are you today?
I'm well. How are you, John?
Also well. Let's begin by having you perhaps define the true role of compliance at an advisory firm.
Excellent. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me on. I'm excited to talk to you, as always, about compliance. The true role about compliance isn't necessarily about policing per se. So I know traditionally that's what where compliance officers, when I say we, compliance officers are seen at, but really the role should be one of partnership. And what I mean by that is you'll hear me say this term, compliance advisor. So over time, you want to build enough rapport as a compliance officer with your financial advisors that you're overseeing that they can approach you proactively before engaging in any activity to discuss, rather than have this sort of adversarial relationship between yourself and the advisor, in that you're not trusted. The advisor feels that they'll be reprimanded by simply asking a question before engaging in any activity. And so really the relationship is based on integrity of the advice that the advisor is providing, safeguarding client outcomes, obviously, and then just supporting the advisor through that decision-making process rather than just saying no. And I'll give you a very quick example of my own personal experience with that. When I was essentially a bank branch advisor, I remember I was paired with a product specialist that I was meant to go to and ask questions about their in-house managed portfolios. And I remember asking a question to my product specialist, and by the time the response came back to me, not only my branch manager, but my regional branch managers were also CC'd on that email. And I found that so odd because I hadn't engaged in any activity that required them to be on that email, but it gave me the notion that, especially in some of the larger dealers and banks, we see compliance as being involved with every aspect of the advisor's communication with the head office and including their bank managers in the correspondence. And so really, there should be a partnership that's built on trust. And again, just walking through the advisor from the initial thought process into the program and then launching it, whether it's a marketing campaign or you're analyzing KYP for a client portfolio, etc. So that should be the role of compliance, in my opinion.
So I realized that maybe I jumped ahead a bit too much. The reason I wanted to have you on more than anything else is because you're a great advocate for advisors working better with clients and with compliance. It's a three-way street. The advisors are the ham and the sandwich between the corporate interests that are being monitored in a proactive and hopefully constructive manner with regard to compliance, but also with regard to client suitability in helping the clients get what's best for them. And as a result of having you on, I'm hoping the people that are watching and listening today can get a sense of how the sausage is made, which is to say, we're pulling back the curtain, and I wanted to have you on so that people who are investors can think about the wealth decisions that are being made, not only by the advisor who's giving the advice, but also within the confines of whatever regulatory obligations are placed upon the advisor, and obviously trying to do what's best for the client. So with that in mind, I wanted to get a sense of whether or not you think compliance has earned its reputation as being a necessary evil. And is it fair? Because as you say, the shared perspective is pretty crucial.
Yeah, absolutely. It has to an extent, unfortunately, and that's simply because some firms have allowed compliance to become reactive, opaque over time, because we don't necessarily see as a driver of the business development. So we have legacy systems, if you look at the traditional compliance programs, we have managers that have been with the dealer for many, many years that are imparting knowledge to some of the newer compliance officers. So you have this feedback loop in that rarely any new thought or ideas brought to the forefront. And so one of the things one of my mentors talks about is industry best practices, dealer best practices, and the rules. And where we fit in, we as in the dealer that I work for, is we focus on the rules. So we have CIRA rules, we have securities acts with the provincial regulatory bodies, and then we have national instruments that we look at. Beyond that, we have industry best practices and dealer best practices. And not to say that those are bad in any way. There could be some best practices that are meaningful and they're client focused. But as an investor, you want to be aligned with an advisor that, number one, is focusing on the rules. But if their dealer is wanting them to engage in any best practices, then those are meaningful for the advisor's business. Because ultimately, if you're a client, John, and you're working with your financial advisor, you want that financial advisor to be focused on what they do best, which is financial planning, investment management, creating an IPS, and maintaining your portfolio, whether that's on a discretionary basis or not. The last thing you want is for your financial advisor to be constantly bombarded by compliance, telling them that they're not that they're breaking any rules, but that they're not meeting industry best practices or dealer best practices. So as an investor, you have to ensure that, when you meet with an advisor, you ask them questions. What type of relationship do they have with their compliance? And at times that'll get the advisor thinking, well, wait a minute. It turns out I don't necessarily have this relationship that I was hoping for when I joined this firm, in that compliance would actually help me drive more business, help me become a better advisor to my clients, help service them better. Essentially, everything that we say we should be doing, as values when you join a firm, but that's not necessarily what we see all the time. So yeah, unfortunately, compliance has earned a necessary evil, and we need to have this talk. And I'll just end on this, and maybe we'll touch back on this in a bit. But one of the ways we're doing this now is, well, number one, having conversations like this, where an advisor and a compliance officer that are both registered with the same dealer on our podcast. But number two, one of the things that I emphasize whenever I work with a compliance team is KYA. So we have KYC, KYP, but I rarely hear KYA, which is know your advisor. So I'm going to say this now, and hopefully it starts picking up, in that I always ask our compliance team to ensure that they know their advisors well. And that's not at the surface level, taking a look at their IA holdings, anything that we can pull a report for, but essentially getting to know who they are, their background. We do what's called a fit and proper test when we register advisors, taking a look at their report, if they have any outside activities that they're engaging in, if they have any. Over time, advisors have told me any family situations that they're going through, and have asked me to essentially be their backup advisor if they're unavailable, if they're meeting with a doctor or a lawyer, etc. So again, knowing your advisor is very crucial. And over time, the more compliance officers do that, the more we'll shift the tide in the industry from becoming the necessary evil to one of the drivers of the business.
So very quickly, what would you say is the biggest myth in the way people think of advisors? And I think you've already told me a lot about what's true, but what would you say is the biggest myth?
The biggest myth I have seen is advisors think that compliance is there to just say no. And that couldn't be furthest from the reality. Is good compliance officers. So I can't speak for everybody. I haven't done compliance at a large banking institution, but good compliance officers do often want to say yes, but in a, say, quote unquote, safe manner. So they'll take a look at, again, rules, policies, and procedures. This is where some compliance officers get caught up, in that they think policies and procedures are set in stone. And that couldn't be furthest from the truth. Often you'll find that policies and procedures were written to protect the dealer, right? So there's no rule in the industry behind that. And we've taken a look at some of our own policies and procedures, and we've changed over time as new rules come out and new guidance notices are issued by the regulators. So constantly we have this conversation where we go back to the CTO and UDP and ask them to review some of the PNP. So I'd say the biggest myth is compliance is just there to say no. That couldn't be furthest from the truth. If you're working with a good compliance officer, they should be finding ways to say yes.
Okay, so let's move on then to regulatory pressure. And I'm going to apologize in advance. So I'm going to see if I can read out all these different acronyms in long form so that people understand what they all are. So I want to ask about how compliance teams are adapting to increased expectations from CIRO. That's the Canadian Investment Industry Regulatory Organization, which is the industry SRO, the self-regulatory organization for the investment industry in Canada, especially with regard to KYP, which is Know Your Product, as well as KYC, Know Your Client, because there's a dovetailing that now has to take place. And as I say, the advisors are the ham and the sandwich. They have to do their product due diligence, which is the KYP, Know Your Product. They have to make sure that it dovetails with the recommendations they're making to different clients. You have to know their clients, and you have to know them both with regard to risk tolerance and risk capacity. How are we adapting to that new regulatory environment where we have to integrate KYC and KYP so that it fits well with what's being advised?
Yeah, so I'll start off with exactly what you alluded to. Risk capacity is now a requirement for us to consider when we meet with a client and go through their risk profile. So when you're discussing net worth, time horizon, risk tolerance, in addition, now you need to be able to talk to the client and ascertain their risk capacity level, which is essentially the capacity that they have through their financial means to take on the risk that you and the client are agreeing to. And between capacity and tolerance, so you have the tolerance capacity, and then you have the investor risk profile. So the regulators are asking that the overall risk profile be constrained to the lesser of the two between tolerance and capacity. And often I get this question from advisors, well, what if the client wants to take on more risk, or the client believes that their capacity is higher, but I know as the financial advisor, in comparison with some of my other clients in the same industry, they're not making that much. They don't have the net worth that they think ascertains a higher capacity. And so it's a constant push and pull between advisors and compliance and advisors and their clients. And I really do feel for financial advisors, and how we're adapting compliance officers is we're looking at a macro level. So we take a look at, okay, can we bucket some of these clients to make it easier for compliance to review the new account application forms, the NCAPs that come through? So we'll take a look at, for example, time horizon, as I alluded to, net worth, even somebody's where they're geographically located is important, because if you think about somebody that's located in rural Saskatchewan, they could be doing very well for themselves with a $100,000 salary. Downtown Toronto, that's the requirement just to pay your bills, right? So we'll take a look at geography. But I'm of the school of thought that bucketing is important. And so that allows you to, again, get to know your advisors, because you know that the clients that they're bringing on fit some type of bucket. And then from those buckets, we have the individual models that the clients fit into. But touching back on something you alluded to is the intersection between KYC and KYP. So suitability is what we look for to ensure that the recommendations advisors are making are suitable for the client. And previously, compliance regimes were focusing more on KYC. Now, you're in the last 4 years through client-focused firms, you're seeing more emphasis on KYP. So whether it's through branch audits, whether it's during daily blotter reviews, whether it's quarterly managed reviews for portfolio managers, there's a higher emphasis on demonstrating the advisor knows their product very well. And this goes beyond just taking a look at what's located in their folder on their computer to see if they're looking at fund facts. It's not that. You need to be able to confirm that you're, as a financial advisor, you know the structure, features, risks, initial and ongoing costs of maintaining that product within your model. And so the bar has been raised higher, and not only for advisors, but also for compliance officers, because just like advisors have a KYP obligation, so do dealers, believe it or not. So through the product review committee, through head office initiatives, we also take a look at the products that we have on our shelf, and we ensure that regularly those are risk weighted appropriately. And if they're not, they're being at least on an annual basis reconsidered if there's been a material change to the underlying or to the strategy or to the fund manager. So again, just to answer your question, circle back, how compliance teams adapting? Well, good compliance teams should be taking a look at what's on their product shelf today, doing at least an annual, if not semi-annual, depending on resources that you can allocate, review and use AI. The AI should be your friend when it comes to product due diligence. There's no reason why you can't take a fund document, an offering memorandum, put it into Copilot and ask it the questions that you're looking for the answers to. Have prompts prepared, whether it's for a REIT, private equity fund, private debt, etc., so that you can go in and retrieve the information that much quicker.
So one of the things that came out when listening to you speak is that advisors really are the ham in a sandwich. We're trying to help people, ordinary retail investors, make better wealth decisions. Some investors know themselves very well. Others, as you mentioned, might not really have a good sense for either their risk tolerance or their risk capacity. And as you mentioned, it's the lesser of the two. Advisors have to be the ones who, in some cases, encourage people to be a little more aggressive because they've got the wherewithal. But in other instances, hold people back a bit. And so the better wealth decisions are ones of calibrating the risk profile of the product with the risk profile of the client to make sure that they dovetail appropriately and that nothing is untoward. And then the oversight is really one of coordination and assistance is coming from the compliance department at the advisory firm. So it's something that I think most people who invest with an advisor never think of, is how that advisor is going to be working with his or her compliance department. Let's see if we can talk about that now. Advisors and compliance departments working together and their culture. I'm wondering if you could tell me what you think makes a good relationship. And again, I'm going to ask you to do it in a triangular sort of way between the advisor, the compliance officer, and then the ultimate investor. And in so doing, I'm wondering if you could actually go one step further and bring in the concept that is being discussed now by regulators, which is a meaningful discussion. How do those three different legs of the stool, the advisor, the compliance department, and the client, work together? And what does it mean in particular with regard to a meaningful discussion?
Okay, excellent. So I'll touch on the first aspect between compliance and advisors. At a basic level, there needs to be mutual respect and early communication with the advisor and their compliance officer. That's the bare minimum. If there's no mutual respect for what the compliance officer does from the advisor and vice versa, because I know a lot of compliance officers haven't actually sat at the kitchen table, they need to be able to understand the complexities involved in running a good practice. So there needs to be mutual respect and early communication. So rather than wait for an advisor to contact the compliance officer every 3 months and report on their new outside activity, why are compliance officers not reaching out to advisors and having those conversations proactively, right? So currently what happens is we'll take a look at a trade, we'll reach out to advisors, they'll either do a KYC update or confirm that they'll be reallocating to bring the portfolio down from risk perspective. And that's the end of the conversation, right? So we don't necessarily get to know who the advisor is or the compliance officer that we're working with. So I think more advisors should push for more of those relationships with good compliance officers that they can see themselves working with, and vice versa. If there's any compliance officers that are looking to take their compliance practice, I'd say, to the next level, they should start engaging with their advisors more and asking for those early communications, reminding them that they're there as a resource. So just like the advisor is an advisor to a client, the compliance ideally should be a compliance advisor to the advisor. And
right.
So when you have those type of meaningful relationships, then rest assured, the advisor is not going to feel that they'll be reprimanded for engaging in something, because you'll have those early communications before engaging in the activity. Now, I'll just briefly touch on the meaningful discussion. So regulators want to see meaningful discussion between the advisor and the client. Well, what does meaningful mean? It means that you should be able to explain the financial circumstances, the personal circumstances. Not only that, but how you've gone through taking that client from a prospect over time to building a model for them or putting them into a portfolio. Why has that worked for that client? The only reason you can explain that is if you have meaningful discussions with the client. It's not enough to say that you've had a prospect meeting, you have a half page of notes, they have a daughter that's 18 years old, and then a week later there's a $500,000 trade into your model that you're putting them into. That's not a meaningful discussion. So regulators are looking for ongoing meaningful discussion. We recommend at least annually. And from those meaningful discussions, you should be able to ascertain if a new KYC document is required. Now, going back to an example of a dealer preference, some dealers will ask that you submit a KYC form annually or every 3 years for retail clients, regardless of if there's been a material change to a client or not. Whereas other dealers, they'll take the approach, we need you to have a meaningful discussion, which is a regulatory requirement, but we trust the advisor will be able to confirm if a KYC update should be done or not. And then whether through branch audits or semi-annual reviews, they're able to test for those by taking a look at those meaningful discussions.
So that could be an example of a competitive advantage that one firm would have. The obligation, again, this is something that I sort of framed it as we started when I introduced you, being wary of best practices. The rules say you have to have a meaningful discussion. They do not say you have to update the client account every year, but there are certain firms that interpret the need for a meaningful discussion as a need to update the account information, and that's just not the case. So do it right on the front end. Make sure you do, in fact, have a full, robust discussion with the client to understand what's going on in his or her life so that you're up to speed with their daughter's getting married, or they might be getting an inheritance, or maybe there's a promotion and that means they can save more on a monthly basis or what have you. But at any rate, you want to be up to speed with what's going on, and you need to think of it in a robust, fulsome manner. But could you just take a moment to explain how the ability to do things based on following the rules, but not necessarily being overly prescriptive with regard to best practices, could be seen as a competitive advantage that actually helps advisors do their job better for their final clients?
Yeah, absolutely. So before I jump into the compliance side, I regularly meet with business development at the dealer I'm with, because the culture there is embedding compliance into strategic decisions, right? And so it's made it so much easier for compliance to be at the forefront of those conversations with prospects. And I often find when I ask questions about their relationship with their compliance officers or their department as a whole at their current dealer, it's usually one of they're looking for enforcement, they're looking for fines, they're looking for penalties, financial penalties, at times close supervision for things that honestly were, numerous examples were not breach of concrete rules. And so when you step back and see, okay, if this is what's occurring in the industry from a strategic standpoint, how can you leverage that as a dealer? Well, number one, if you bring your compliance officer on the first call with your prospect, immediately it lets the advisor know, well, wait a minute, if compliance is on the call with the business development officer, or they're traveling to meet prospects in different provinces, that should tell them that they have a somewhat of a meaningful relationship working between the two departments. And so really, it should be such that compliance is embedded into strategic decisions. And then how that helps advisors is that if you have a good relationship with your compliance officer, number one, they're not bombarding you with emails constantly about your portfolios. Number two, they're not focused on best practices. They're focused on industry rules, which ideally, if you're also an advisor that's not treading the lines, then you should be getting lesser inquiries. That means you have more time to service your clients. That means you can have more meaningful discussions with your clients rather than your compliance officer, because you're receiving less inquiries. That allows you to focus more time on service rather than administration, which is essentially reaching out to compliance and answering their questions.
I wonder if I could just take a moment to clarify something when you and I use the phrase best practices, because the people listening might think that we're anti-best practices. When you and I talk about best practices, what we often mean are individual companies' rules that they've made up to serve the individual company. And it's not necessarily even a best practice. They call it that as a proxy to justify doing things. But there's the point that I think you're making that I think needs to be made very clearly is that you absolutely have to follow the rules, and you absolutely do. But there are a lot of things that are seen as being like a rule that are really just companies that this is the way we do things around here, but there's no rule underpinning doing it. And there's nothing stopping an advisor from doing something differently, other than some firms are overly prescriptive and they'll say, well, this is the way you have to do things. And I guess what I'm hearing from you is there's no intent on your part as a compliance officer to be prescriptive about how to do things. Just follow the rules. How you follow them is up to you. Just, you have to be compliant, but it ends there. You've mentioned the AI a couple of times already, and because everyone's talking about AI now, it's the second half of 2025. AI is all the rage. what can you maybe offer in terms of how AI is changing the way compliance people do their job?
Yeah, sure. So I'll give you an example of what we do currently. We use Copilot, which is part of the Microsoft ecosystem, to review offering memorandum and other marketing materials, due diligence packages that are received for funds that are not issued via prospectus. So they don't come with a standard fund fact risk rating. By doing that, we've probably cut down our due diligence time from, say, if it was 10 hours before for a particular fund, down to 2. We still meet with the asset managers. We still like to have a conversation with them, but we know exactly the prompts we're looking for. We know the answers. In many cases, the asset managers know the questions we're going to ask anyways. They're based on the AMA questionnaires that are available online, but we know that the questions are coming. So we can get ahead of that by uploading the offering memorandum into Copilot, asking the questions that we need, and then getting better prepared, because we're looking for questions or answers that might not necessarily make sense, or raise questions that raise more questions. And then we can go back to the asset managers more prepared, rather than feeling, oh, we have to read through this 80-page offering memorandum, do our due diligence. And by the time that's done and you go back to the asset manager, it could be weeks before that can happen. So by doing that, we can essentially review more products thoroughly using AI. We can potentially get more products across the finish line over to the product review committee, risk rated. And what that does, John, is that allows advisors to essentially have a broader product shelf, and there's risk ratings assigned before those purchases are made. So when compliance officers log into a client portfolio, they see the holding, they see the associated risk rating. And so what you don't want is, and I've seen this happen, unfortunately, is for months on months, a client holding sitting in the account with no risk rating, and the compliance officer can't do their job because there's no risk rating associated with the product. They can't necessarily ascertain suitability or risk on that product. So that's one of the ways I know advisors are using AI in their day-to-day. They're taking a look at speech-to-text CRM systems. Be careful with those. If a client took you to court, you can't necessarily, at this point, to my knowledge, pass off accountability to an AI system, right? So ensure that if you're doing speech-to-text, I always recommend go through your notes afterwards. I have personally seen in auditing speech-to-text create very thorough notes, and some of the things that were very material, such as the ticker, the dollar amount of the purchase, get completely overlooked. I don't know why that happens. Maybe it's because the advisor was speaking in acronyms or mentioning dollar amounts that were not getting picked up. So again, if you do decide to use speech-to-text, I would highly recommend that you have a process. Give yourself enough time between one meeting to another to review your notes to ensure that everything is getting captured, because at this point, there's no way that you can pass off accountability to an AI system and say, well, AI didn't pick it up, but I meant to do that, or I meant to say that. That's not appropriate.
Perfect. Okay, so I have so many more questions I'd want to ask you, but we've just run out of time. So I like to end by asking the same question that I ask all my guests. The podcast is called Make Better Wealth Decisions. From your perspective as a compliance officer for a nationally regulated firm, what advice would you give listeners to help them understand? Normally, I would say to make them make better wealth decisions, but maybe to help them understand the decision-making process at a regulated firm.
Okay, that is definitely a loaded question. And I'll summarize by saying, as an investor, number one, if you're doing research on an advisor, there's public information online. Look into the advisor, look into their regulatory history, see if they've faced any fines before. You can find, there's a report called Serial Know Your Advisor. Search up the advisor you're currently working with or you're looking to work with. Not only that, you can also search up the firm that they're associated with and see if they've faced any fines or penalty in the past. And that, as an investor, will give you an in into the compliance culture that they have from a regulatory standpoint, the processes that they have or lack of thereof. And that might be a unique way for an investor to approach a newer advisor or building a relationship with an advisor that might be trying to generate business from them, right? So take a look at who they are, who they're registered with, and hopefully that will allow you as an investor to make better decisions for yourself.
Perfect. Fardan, this has been wonderful. I'm really glad we had this chat because I think you've done a lot to, as you say, pull back the curtain to help people understand the interplay and the advisor role in giving advice to retail clients to helping them make better wealth decisions, but to do so within the confines of doing everything the regulators ask. So I want to thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks for having me on. Been a pleasure.
This podcast is not to be construed as offering specific investment advice. Please consult a qualified advisor before acting. My books, Stand Up to the Financial Services Industry and Bullshift, are available online. If you'd like to meet to discuss how the topics in this podcast affect you directly, please visit my website.